Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How wonderful to see so many of you here. My name is Kate Moss. I'm a novelist and a playwright and the biographer of CFT, as we rather grandly put it. And it's my enormous pleasure to involve you tonight in what's a little bit of an experiment. So this is one of the events that we are doing here at the theatre in association with the University of Chichester, down the way. And we wanted to see if there would be an appetite to do some events that went into issues about some of the plays that have been on this season in a little bit more depth. Because many of you, I know, come along to hear the artists talk, the directors talk, the actors talk. But we promised you experts, and tonight you have some experts. They are going to be expert. So this event is called The Legacy of Conflict. And what we're looking at is the cultural legacy of the First World War, in connection to start with the Somerset Maugham play, For Services Rendered. Can you just indulge me, and who has already seen the play? So you needn't be too worried about spoiler alerts. Who is going in to see it this evening? Very good. And has anybody not got a ticket? Because it's too late, it finishes tomorrow. No. Oh, no. Well, I'm sorry about that. Oh, dear. Well, let's see if we can whet your appetite. I'm sure there might be one sneaky ticket. So we're going to talk about the play specifically, and then we're going to open it out. We're going to chat, as it were, privately amongst ourselves for about 40 minutes, and then we will throw it open to you for questions. And then, in time-honoured tradition, as you know, we will be out of here pretty sharp at 6:30 to give the house back to the players for them to warm up. So, the experts that I promised you. On the far right there is Dr. Miles Leeson. He is the senior lecturer, although I've been calling you the senior lecturer all the way through, and I think we should stick with that, in English literature at University of Chichester, having previously taught at Portsmouth and the University of Sussex, where he did his D.Phil. So you're very much a local boy, then, a local person. He is currently completing a second monograph, which is called Beings in Time, the Philosophical Novelist in the 20th Century. And, of course, there are many other papers and things that Miles has done. And if you go on the university website, you will get their full CVs, which are far too long for me to read out in public. In the middle here is Dr. Ross Wilson, and he is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Chichester. His first degree was in archaeology, and then he did a PhD in archaeology and history at the University of York, where he also did his master's. And he's written several books, including 3 books explaining the cultural impact of the First World War. And I think the latest was The Cultural Heritage of the Great War in Britain, and that was your most recent book. So what we're going to do is that Miles is going to speak for about 5-6 minutes, just to give his view of Maugham and the general context, and then Ross will speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about some of the issues that have come up. So, Miles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everybody. I'm not too sure how well you know Maugham. He's certainly somebody that's been overlooked a little bit. So I want to give you a little bit of context to the background, not only of the play, but also of him. But we'll do more on that later. I think it's very interesting, his take on the British middle class at this specific point in time, in the sort of late 20s, early 30s, when, in some respects, the sort of the sympathy that's given over to the war wounded and the shell-shocked is beginning to sort of slip away, ebb away a little bit in the British consciousness, I suppose. And I think this play really picks up on some of those issues, and certainly through Sydney, but also, I think, and perhaps more interestingly for me, being interested in writing on women's literature, specifically on the women in the play, and that's something I'd like to explore a little bit later with you. So, as you know, Maugham has a great sort of a knowledge of this period, having lived through it, but also being born quite a way before that in the 19th century. And he covers a huge span of time, really, dying, I think, in his early 90s. And during the First World War, not only an ambulance driver, but also a secret agent and working for the civil service. So he really brings a whole breadth of knowledge to this play, and I'm sure those of you who have seen it have picked up on that as well. And the questions that the play raise, I think, are very much to do with obviously the aftermath of the war, but also the difference between the sexes and this sort of the gender differentiation that we see within the play, because it's not just the obvious wounding of Sydney, but also the mental burden that's placed upon some of his relations as well, most notably Eva. And I don't want to talk too much about that, specifically because some of you haven't seen the play yet. But there's certainly a lot to talk about and discuss perhaps later on. Indeed, as a member of the audience, what struck me was the roles given to the female characters by Maugham. And rather than by them being overly traditional, I think we see all of the female characters, not just the sisters, but also Gwen and also Mrs. Ardsley as well, actually pushing against this sort of the sphere that the female has been put in, under. And this is something that other writers of the period pick up on, most notably, of course, writers that are working in a much more modernist tradition than Maugham was, people like Woolf and Richardson as well. And I think that's part of the reason, perhaps, why Maugham has kind of slipped from not just a critical consciousness, but also a consciousness in the popular imagination as well, as far as those who read go. I don't know what your reading habits are like, but perhaps they don't include Maugham generally. Certainly his short stories are perhaps the most interesting critically at the moment, but his plays, I know Ross will be talking about this in a little while, about the sort of the early reception of services rendered. So I'll leave that up to him in a minute. But certainly in the 21st century, Maugham, along with people like John Galsworthy and Arnold Bennett and George Gissing, sort of maybe names sort of half remembered to some of you, are just not that well critically acclaimed anymore. And I think it's maybe time that they were. And certainly it's something that perhaps we can pick up on later on in the talk. To come back to this idea of women, the differentiation between the male and the female in this play, I think the male characters all fulfil a kind of a traditional role. Sidney is almost like, in some respects, a broken record, just repeating, in some respects, a very darkly comic effect, this idea of the notion of the war wounded. His father, very much in the traditional stuffed shirt male, I think he's been critically thought of. Whereas the women are very much restless, as I've said, as is, of course, Wilfrid, but for rather different reasons. The women then are quite complex and something that we'll be picking up on later. And unlike a sort of a classic Victorian or early 20th century drawing room drama, or maybe even a drawing room comedy or farce that you may be expecting when you first come to the play, it's certainly something that I was expecting. I was thinking there might be a few more laughs. And there are laughs, but they're dark, aren't they? And perhaps we almost feel like we shouldn't laugh at some of these in some places, but we do, just to alleviate the tension. I think part of that is because it's far more in tune with modernity as it's developing than perhaps other works of the period. And it's certainly something that later on we'll talk about, I'm sure, this idea of sort of a reassessment of not just this play, but perhaps more widely of Maugham's work. Because he did write a whole range of stuff, not just novels and plays, but poetry and non-fiction as well. But certainly something that, some areas that we can come that I've sort of roughly sketched that we can come back to, but at this point I'm going to pass over to Ross to talk as well.
Lovely, thanks Miles. Ross.
I think what interests me about the play is the sense of absence that Miles alluded to. Because it is written and performed in the early 1930s, it hasn't become part of that wider war canon that we celebrate and we know well. Sassoon, Graves, All Quiet on the Western Front. It isn't part of that wider war literature. And it's interesting that it was performed in the early 1930s because this is an era when our ideas about the First World War are formed, and they're formed through literature, they're formed through those cultural representations. If you think about it today, if I mention the words to you, the Somme, the trenches, Passchendaele, Gallipoli, these words, these names automatically conjure up an image of the war. And by and large, they're the image of the trenches, the shell-shattered landscape of the Western Front. For services rendered doesn't have that same sense of impact. It doesn't create that same sense of legacy within the British cultural memory. And I find that very interesting, because essentially it isn't taken in by the public because it's too hard, it's too difficult. The play in its initial performance in the 1930s was met with a really critical response. Some people thought it was challenging, it was important, it was significant, but it was also welcomed by reviews, one which was published in the Leeds Post Intelligentsia in the 1930s, as a gloomy war play. This is a play which doesn't immediately speak to the wider public. It doesn't tell them about the war and the way in which they want to hear about it. As such, For Services Rendered becomes forgotten, abandoned. It doesn't create that same sense of legacy within British popular culture that we have with Sassoon or Graves. It's published at the same time, but doesn't have the same effect. And that's largely, I think, because of its setting. It's set in the post-war era, in the early 1930s. Although it concerns the war and the way in which the war has damaged people's lives, it doesn't actually feature the battlefields, the trenches. That image of the First World War isn't present within the play. As opposed to something like R.C. Sheriff's Journey's End, which is published in 1928, you've got a whole variety of other plays, such as The Conquering Hero, which is first performed in 1923 by Alan Monkhouse. These are plays which touch on similar ideas about loss, about disillusion, but they have firm meanings about the war, about pacifism, about the way in which people were called up to fight for their country and have become disillusioned. For Services Rendered is far more ambiguous and far more difficult for audiences, and as such, it becomes forgotten. We choose our particular memories of the war. We choose them for a purpose because it says something about us. For Services Rendered did not say something about society as it was in the early 1930s. But you can see how it's beginning to say something about our society today. Those issues of returning soldiers, maimed and wounded soldiers, the notion of government responsibility, the way in which we care for others. This is a play which, although about the First World War, finds far more effect within contemporary audiences, perhaps, than it did with its audiences in the 1930s.
That is a brilliant place to stop, because many of you, I think, came to hear Howard Davis talk about the play. And one of the things that he picked up, you have both picked on, was the fact that there was this idea of what were we fighting for if it was not a country fit for heroes? And in this drawing room, it is clear that the country they were fighting for has not been delivered back to them. So can we just talk a little bit then about the two different ways of looking at war literature? The literature written by combatants and veterans and men and women who had been at the front or worked in the hospitals, and that's the 16, 17, 18, whether it's Vera Brittain, it's, you know, obviously Sassoon, Graves you mentioned, and then people like Maugham who were looking at the consequence of war. So can you just talk a little bit about when there started to be this explosion of literature and plays, why that war was mapped so precisely by the arts rather than by politics?
Well, I think within the post-war world, you get an explosion of war literature around about 1928. You get novels, memoirs, which are all published during this period. There have been books about the war previously. Throughout the 1920s, you have novels and memoirs that are published. But after 1928, there is an explosion in war literature. You have a huge appetite amongst the public. And essentially, it's a battleground in itself because it becomes about what the war meant, how the war should be remembered, how you should think about the conflict. And those novels and memoirs about the conflict, which are published after 1928, take differing perspectives. They're not all pacifist. They're not all indictments of current society. There are novelists, there are veterans who write about how fantastic their war experience was, who say this was the time of their lives. And that perception is also featured in For Services Rendered as well, that the war was an exciting time. It made your life different. And you have novelists and memoirists who tell about the war in such a fashion, who regard the war as being a great adventure, and still do in the 1920s. You still have reunions of old officers. You still have people celebrating their time in the conflict. But at the same time, you begin to get a variety of literature, memoirs and novelists, which describe the war as a failure, which talk about the disillusionment of the war. Mm-hmm. And that's largely in response to a post-war world, where the economic situation within Britain is fragile at best, that the country has not delivered a home for heroes as they had hoped it would do, that Britain's place on the global stage has been much diminished by the effects of the war. Britain was left bankrupt by the conflicts and significantly reduced on the political stage because of its involvement in the First World War. So essentially you get the emergence of a group of authors, largely veterans, but some of them who didn't serve in the conflict at all, who talk about the war as a process of disillusionment.
Yeah, they've been sold, you know, it's the Joan Littlewood and Oh, What a Love, you know, that this was all a con, really.
Which is interesting because that's the vision of the war that we inherit.
Yeah.
Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, you have a variety of different interpretations about what the conflict was, how it should be remembered, whether it was a glorious patriotic endeavour or whether it was a failure which caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. What wins is that disillusioned view. But it's interesting to see that this is a play which actually addresses both perspectives. You can see within the play the difficulty that a family and a community and a country have with coming to terms with a conflict and how it's played out.
I think we can see the same thing if we go a little bit deeper into what literature actually means. If we separate out the memoir from the fiction, from the non-fiction, the poetry from the play as well. If we think about how realist writers are actually thinking about the war, and how perhaps they're slightly more black and white about whether it was, you know, a glorious adventure or whether it was an abject failure.
Can you give us a couple of examples of the writers you're thinking of there?
So, for example, if we're thinking on something a little bit more nuanced, we might think of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where the war has happened, but it's happening again within the mind of the shell-shocked Septimus Smith, for example. But it's also affecting Clarissa Dalloway herself. For example, when she hears the car backfire, she thinks it's a gunshot, for example. Whereas I think that there's some sort of link that we can draw with Services Rendered. Again, it's quite nuanced in its approach. There are quite obvious ways in which Maugham is telling us that the war has been an abject failure and hasn't created a land fit for heroes, but it's also saying something about how women are reacting and how the war has actually been quite useful for women. Whereas for Mr. Ardsley, I think the speech that he gives right at the end is him almost referring back to this glorious long summer of 1912. And he's almost referencing Brooke, the idea of does the clock still stand?
A little bit of Heartbreak House as well.
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah. You know, the clock at 10 to 3, and is there honey still for tea? He's actually, I think Maugham is actually picking up on a much earlier tradition that's for that specific character that doesn't actually want to think that the war has actually changed anything, whereas quite obviously it's changed for all of his offspring and also everybody else that's involved in the play. Whereas, as Ross picked up on the memoir, there's very different accounts depending on whether it's somebody that's actually served in the trenches and somebody's picked that up, or whether they've written it themselves. And a lot of the war literature and a lot of the war memoir wasn't actually picked up in the 20s and 30s. Was actually picked up much later when people and academic critics have actually sort of rediscovered memoirs and diaries. Whereas, of course, those who were able to publish and had the ability to do that were much more in the middle to upper class, officer class anyway. So again, throughout the course of the 20th century, we're getting a real sort of constant discovery and rediscovery of documentation. So I think there's those differences to be drawn out, not just between the fiction and the non-fiction, but also between the memoir and a much more, perhaps a more honest account that we might find in a memoir that's been more recently discovered.
Yes, because some of those memoirs, particularly the ones by women, whether it's May Sinclair's sort of semi-autobiographical novels, or obviously, you know, Vera Brittain and others, Willa Cather writing, you know, rather gung-ho-ish fiction, actually. But, of course, those are different experiences from the experience of a soldier, so you have all of that. I just want to pick up on this point about women and the position of women. This, you know, whatever one might feel about the process of women's suffrage and the extension of the vote, firstly to women over 30 and then for
I think it's a good thing.
Good. I'm glad that you think that. And I was going to throw it over.
That's good.
But there is the same betrayal of what was promised for women as well as for men, isn't there? The idea that many women were suddenly quite free to act and be purposeful in the war, and then when the men came home, the jobs were needed, and many then had to go back into the domestic setting. So there's male and female disappointment about what the war hasn't delivered, maybe.
I think there's an exaggeration, perhaps, in how the war actually liberated women. I mean, there's a great history that the war created opportunities, employment, enabled women to experience life in different ways, but ultimately those ways in which women experienced life during the First World War were still confined by rather traditional ideas about what women should be doing. Association with nursing, farming. This is still a patriarchal society which still narrowly confines the expectations of women and their lives. And you see that present within, throughout the First World War. You see it placed wonderfully with For Services Rendered, where those women are still trapped by their lives. So although the First World War is regarded as being this moment when women were able to take a greater place on the social scale, in reality, it's still the same story. It's still the same problems that women are facing. And ultimately, 10 years after the conflict has ended, it's still the same problems that those women are having in a small village in the South Downs, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the the tragedy of this play, is that they are still, even though they've now perhaps got a stronger grasp of their abilities, the opportunities that have now been taken away, then the way in which Maugham actually explores those in some of the scenes that are in the play and some of the language that they're using to actually express their dissatisfaction with their lives, especially Eva and Lois as well, and the ways and means in which they try and escape but are ultimately perhaps stymied within the play. I think it's something that certainly taps into that the national feeling that perhaps women did feel in the late 20s, early 30s, and I think that is brought out very well within the play.
No, I think that it's the way in which women are featured within the play, but also, without wishing to talk about men, it's the way in which Sydney features. Talk about men.
Yeah. We are a mixed audience.
It's the way in which Sydney features in the play as well. I think Sydney within the play as a wounded veteran. He is a disabled former serviceman. He's a war hero, a decorated war hero, but yet by the early 1930s, he's a burden. A horrendous burden on his family, a burden that he knows that he is, and he also plays it up as well. He makes people's lives far more difficult than they should be. He makes his sister's life a misery. He taunts his mother, essentially. He's not a pitiable figure. You imagine that the wounded soldier, the wounded war hero, should be someone that you can sympathize with, who should be gracious, virtuous, but Maugham portrays him as someone who is basically almost poisoning his family. Now, this is an attitude of late 1920s, early 1930s Britain, where those war heroes, those maimed war heroes, are becoming increasingly burdensome upon society. They're drawing pensions. They're still unable to work in the same way they'd worked previously. This is another legacy of the war which the play is trying to address. People are physically and emotionally damaged, and Sydney, although he should be a sympathetic figure, is cast as being painfully out of place within his family.
But that, I think, is one of the extraordinary things that Maugham succeeds in doing. You said right at the beginning, Miles, that, you think, and when you walk in here particularly, before you notice the barbed wire behind the French windows, you think, a drawing room piece.
Sure.
And there are two very radical characterizations in the play, not just the ensemble nature of it, equal numbers of women and men, but as you've said, Sydney, who is not sympathetic. So that is quite a radical decision for the playwright to have made, that actually this person isn't very nice. And that's the deserving and undeserving, who deserves our charity and our pity and who doesn't. And the second one, I would say, without giving anything away, is the mother, who at a key moment decides that she will not be a mother. And that is an incredibly radical thing to do in a play in the 1930s, isn't it, really?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, we see this sort of idea of a woman with children deciding in some, and we won't give too much away here, deciding that actually they would give up everything, but they wouldn't actually give up themselves. This idea of female selfhood. It's certainly something that happens earlier in fiction. I'm thinking of the American novelist Kate Chopin's The Awakening, that comes right at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900. But whether Maugham read that or not, I don't know. But certainly through the development of female fiction in the early 20th century, we see these ideas of what it actually means to be a mother and to be a woman coming into a vast amount of conflict, actually, as this idea of selfhood is changed by not just by the memory of war and of conflict, but also of the developing idea of female suffrage, but also this idea of the question of domesticity and what does it mean to be domestic? What does it mean to actually have opportunities both inside and outside of the home? And this idea of giving up this idea of a maternal instinct, or at least giving up motherhood in some respects, is something that, as you say, is quite radical. I think it's much more radical for a man in the early 1930s to put this into a play that's going to be actually viewed, rather than being in a novel which is going to be sort of a little bit more passively read. And perhaps a little bit more nuanced. When you see it on the stage, it's a lot more obvious and a lot more disarming in a way. Whereas in a novel setting, I think it's easier for the reader to actually get a grasp of that.
One of the other things, just slightly extrapolating out for services rendered in particular, is that the war, in terms of its cultural legacy, appeared in popular culture too. So it isn't only the leading playwrights and novelists and poets of the day, but actually, for all of you who have listened to me ever, will know that I'm a mad Agatha Christie nut. But actually, who is Poirot? He's a Belgian refugee from the First World War, and he annoys people because they've had enough of refugees. In the first novel, Mysterious Affair at Styles, 1920s it was published, written in 1916. So it's already spilling into everything that artists might do, isn't it? It's not just writing about the war, it's the world that the war has left.
No, it shadows all those cultural representations that you see throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. Essentially, the First World War haunts popular culture in Britain, but also for the rest of Europe. So you could have a novel, a play, a poem, a film which might talk about the social relations, political ideals, but it's all framed by what's happened over the course between 1914 to 1918, the loss of life, the legacy of the conflict. It is a shadow from which you're unable to escape from. Its effects on people, its effects on economies, its effects on politics, and the social relations amongst people has ensured that even though you're not talking about the war, you're still referencing it. You can't escape it. And essentially that's what you see played out in this drawing room. You can't see anybody escape a conflict which happened a decade ago.
Do you think it's possible nowadays for those of us who are writers or playwrights or poets or biographers, is it possible for people now to write something set in the First World War or in the aftermath of the First World War? Or do you think, in a way, everything that can be said has been said?
I think it's very difficult to find an angle. I think, as Ross was saying earlier before the talk, I'm sure
which is no use to you.
Which is no use to you. Absolutely, but
it was very good. Though.
It was very good, and I'm sure we'll pick up on this in a minute. Once you start, setting a novel or a play at that point in time, or in the 20s or 30s, you are writing within, a structure that's already been set out for you. You're writing in response to other works, even if you haven't read them. Even if you've read a work that's been influenced by another work, there is still some continuum that's bringing you back. And to find that angle and to find that sort of area that you're going to be writing in and discussing, that's then actually not just interesting to an audience, but also is appropriate, whatever that means. In fiction, I think it's really quite difficult because you're always going to be haunted by the ghosts coming off the page. There's this a real difficulty, I think, in actually talking about the trenches, talking about the front, talking about the home front, talking about what women were doing, how it impacted on children's lives, how the loss of tens and hundreds of thousands of male lives throughout Europe it's always going to be very, very difficult.
I would also say no as well, rather bluntly. No. I think it's very difficult because not only as an author, as an artist, you might want to talk about and you might want to engage with the First World War, you also have to take into account what your audience expects from that piece of work as well. And there is an expectation about what the First World War looks like, sounds like, should appear either on screen or on a page. And you can't escape that. Automatically, if you write a piece about the First World War where the generals were actually really nice, that they, really kind, supportive individuals, there was no class problems whatsoever, soldiers willingly did their bit, didn't complain once, people at home were very happy all the way through, that knowing that your country was doing its best against the enemy. That's not a vision of the war that you could possibly put into fiction. It's not a vision of the war you could probably put on screen. So there's your audience expectations of what a piece about the war should look like. And that's why I found those initial critical responses for services rendered so interesting, because it isn't what people expect to see about the war. Mm.
And they did resent it. A lot of the critics, were quite blunt about it not being...
They were, but they also put it in terms in which that they would say, oh, the first act is very slow, oh, the character of Sydney is not particularly well developed. We don't like the way in which the women talk to each other, or the way that women talk to men. We're not particularly happy about that. And of course, the vast majority of the critics were males coming in to think about this, who had experience of the war, and resented any sort of change to the war narrative that they had in their head. Of course, so I think that was one of the major problems. They sort of don't even, there's a little bit of faint praise, but they damn it by actually saying, that it's not a good play. It's not one of Maugham's best.
Yes.
It's not, and that's the way in which they actually sort of restricted the impact of it. And of course, the first run was sort of truncated a little bit as well. It only ran for, I think, 30 or 40 shows. And perhaps that's also why that it hasn't had that many revivals throughout the 20th century.
And I mean, I partly asked that question because as a novelist myself, I have written a novel set in the Second World War, because precisely that point, it seemed possible to find a story that wasn't familiar to tell. But with the First World War, I wrote a novel that's set in 1928, having noticed that there was this huge explosion. And for me, what was interesting, almost all my heroes are women, except in The Winter Ghosts, which some of you I know have read. And my hero is a man then, and he's a broken man, because one of the things that seemed interesting to me was that in the same way that women were not allowed to carry on being active, that many men, nice normal men, had survivor guilt because they hadn't fought, and secondly were told that they had no right to grieve because their mothers and daughters, sisters came first. So do you think that is also part of a missing story about men's grief after the war, or do you think that came and went quite quickly and it was about the world that people lived in?
No, I think certainly you've got the way in which men who may have served in the conflict try to adjust to their post-war lives, the fact that their friends, their loved ones have been killed, the way in which their social relations have all been altered because of the effects of the conflict as well. I think the way in which the war actually created social relations as well was quite important. As I mentioned earlier, many veterans actually found the conflict to be incredibly uplifting. They were happy to take part. And one of the things that they miss in the 1920s is those social relations they created in the army. There are numerous men's clubs, old regimental clubs, which are formed in the 1920s and 1930s to recreate that atmosphere, to try and pull it back together. So there is a sense of loss, both of that sense of the way in which you survive the conflict. There's also a sense of loss of the war itself, because for some individuals, this was a hugely uplifting time.
It was their moment of glory.
Absolutely. This is the moment where you were able to have an unrestricted life in some ways. Although the army is very regimented, without wanting to make a pun, you do have an opportunity there which is very different from your civilian life. There's if I have time for a quick story?
Yeah.
I was looking through a sound archive in the Imperial War Museum years ago, and there was one gentleman who was in his 70s and he was being interviewed for years after the war, during the 1960s, where you have people going out and recording people's memoirs. And it was recorded and stored in the Imperial War Museum. And he tells a story about being stuck in the mud of the Western Front. and how he fell off at one of the duck boards and was stuck, his legs got stuck, and then he sank down to his waist, and he couldn't get out. And eventually, as he waited there for a while, a British regiment came along and tried to pull him out, but they couldn't. And then an Australian group came along and tried to pull him out, but they couldn't. And then a Canadian troop came along, and they couldn't pull him out either. Then finally a New Zealand troop came along, and they were all able to finally pull him out. And he's telling this story. He's laughing. It's the funniest story of his life, really. How you have a multinational effort to try and get him from the mud. Yeah. And the interviewer stops him and says, "Now, come on, that's not right. You're not telling the whole story. This is a time of war. You were faced with unimaginable horrors. You suffered immeasurably." And the gentleman said, "Well, sometimes, but sometimes I had a lot of fun too." And it's that difficulty of trying to create an image of the conflict that we see forming in the 1920s and 1930s. There is a sense of loss, but there is a sense of the war for some people was actually meaningful. It actually did something for them.
Yeah, of course. A couple more before we go out to questions. First, do you think there will ever be a world experience in the way that the First World War was a world experience that will result in so much literature, so much painting, so much music? Because other conflicts haven't produced this massive body of work. So what is it about the 1914-18 conflict that changed so much in the arts?
After you.
Small question. I just thought I might as well ask, because they are experts, ladies and gentlemen, you see. This is it.
I think different forms of medium coming on. I think the development of radio, the development of film, and actually to come onto film, of course, whenever we see film of the First World War, it's always part of that mythology. It's always devastating. It's always people being, war wounded, being carried on shoulders, or people being, people going over the top and being shot, or whatever. It feeds into that mythology that Ross was picking up on. And I think as the development in education, developing people being able to read and write themselves, and the explosion in media during and then after the First World War gave people the access that they needed. The development of the journal and the newspaper industry as well to actually
Smith's lending libraries.
Exactly, yeah. So I think in that situation, it opens up a whole new vista to both men and to women to actually be able to get involved and actually have an experience, not just through, of course, literature and the arts, but also, of course, everybody knew someone and probably lost someone as well, whether that be a brother, a son, an uncle, or a next-door neighbour. Everybody had almost an immediate experience of the war. That's why they were so sort of tuned into that experience. And I don't know whether another event or series of events in world history could ever produce that again.
I think you'd also have to take into account the fact that we're talking about the British experience of the conflict as well. The First World War was a global war which encompassed millions of people all across the world. But yet it has a particular place within British cultural life. I do some work on the experience of the First World War in the United States, and for the vast majority of Americans, the First World War does not feature as part of their sort of national cultural narrative, the stories you tell about yourself, about your nation, about who you are. But in Britain it does. Ted Hughes, the former poet laureate, once referred to the First World War as the nation's number one ghost. Because in a sense, that's what it is for British people. It is a conflict which we can't help but return to and still talk about. I think largely because it has such meaning for us, that it still evokes emotions 100 years after the ceasefire. It still has that effect on society. And it's that peculiar British narrative about the war. The war doesn't feature in the same way in France, definitely doesn't feature in the same way in Germany. It is a specifically myopic British obsession with a conflict which started at the beginning of the 20th century and whose veterans have now all passed away. So in terms of another global event which will churn out as much cultural responses, I do not think so, because with the variety of media, as Miles was saying now, you have a huge array of different responses to world events. But for Britain and for all the individuals, groups, communities throughout Britain, I think there's a sense that we'll always return to the trenches. one way or another, because it has had such effects on who we are, essentially.
And we sit here on this amazing set. The production here, Howard Davis's production, has had wonderful reviews, and it has been seen as a revival of a really great piece of work, and that's a wonderful thing to see. You've mentioned many writers between you. You know, the ones that we know, sort of, you know, All Quiet on the Western Front, the Graves, Ford Madox Ford, Herbert, Sheriff, all of these people. If you were to sort of be talking to somebody who knew nothing of this, and you were to press one of these books into their hands, which would you feel has the most value in terms of the fact that it represents a lot about what the war means? You know, do you have... I know this is I hate it when I'm asked, what's your favourite book? But actually, I think, given there's so much, it is quite an interesting question. Is there one that has particular value to both of you, that you would never talk about the war without mentioning that particular text?
Miles?
Very clever.
Yeah, thanks. I think for immediacy, I think you've got to go back to poetry, actually. I think for that and that sort of immediate aesthetic impact, and to get so much out of one reading, I think you'd have to have a sort of a selection of either Gurney, Rosenberg, Graves, Wilfred Owen Sassoon. I think if you could put together 5 or 6 of the key war poets, I think that would be much more effective than almost any novel could be, I think, just because of the immediate impact of what you're going to get out of that, the stark imagery.
The sort of visceral.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a novel is better in a sense because it's developmental, but I think the impact of a short poem, the impact is much more immediate, and I think that's what we want from the First World War. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
No, that sense of immediacy is definitely important. I was tempted to plug a book as soon as you said, "Can you recommend one book?" I thought I could have one that I've written. That's fine. That's very cruel. I won't do that.
You're quite young looking for a veteran, though.
True, that's true. But I think one piece which, for me, encapsulates the war would be as a memoir which was written in 1917 by a woman called Violetta Thurston. And she is from the south of England, but she joins the nursing corps, and she goes off and is a nurse on the Eastern Front, and she's a nurse on the Western Front, and she writes about her experiences behind the lines and at the front in terms of where she is, with the same sense of immediacy and the same sense of emotional intensity that you would find in any of the established writers of the conflict. And I think it's having the war told to you by a different voice, which I think has a huge effect on your understanding of the conflict, because this is a woman who essentially takes part in the war in a variety of different arenas. It's not just on the Western Front. It is in Eastern Europe. It is in Southern Europe, where she's based as well. So I think for one particular piece which could tell you about the war from a different angle, it would definitely be Violetta Thurston.
And I suppose it's only fair, you know, but as a novelist, I, of course, have to say a novel. For me, and of course it's a translation that I've read it in, All Quiet on the Western Front, which I still think is probably the best anti-war novel ever. But the reason that I think it's so valuable is the last paragraph, as much as anything else. Of course, he was a veteran coming back. But the last paragraph begins, as you know, he died on a day when all was quiet on the Western Front. And that, for me, sums up the reality of war, which is it isn't all the big explosions and the music playing in the background and the thundering horses' hooves and all of the rest of it. You could be got at any moment, and it could be just another day, and then you're not anymore. And so for me, that, as a writer, that cleverness of that actually the futility of it is contained in that one sentence when it shouldn't have happened. Right, we are going to throw it open now to you, the audience, to ask any of the questions you would like. And I will repeat questions if the audience can't hear them. Thank you very much, madam.
I was wondering how accurate is this depiction that women, when the men came back, felt a duty and that their service would come in taking care of the wounded, the blind, the people without Egypt, how much I didn't really realise that at all. And seeing that women, you know, were offering themselves in this way and felt that that's what they should do. I had no idea. Was that really quite a large movement?
The question was how accurate and true an idea it was that women who had been involved in war work and when the men came back felt that it was their duty to then step back and care for the returning people and those people who were injured and unable to look after themselves. How accurate is that piece of social history?
Well, as part of sort of the way in which women were expected to act and to be responsible in society, it was very, very accurate, in fact. Women who found themselves, whose husbands, whose fathers, whose brothers may have come back from the war maimed and disfigured somewhat, it would be their responsibility to take care of them. Because this is a society which is before the National Health Service. This is a society before those institutions of the state have been created. In essence, therefore, how you're cared for is by your immediate family, and by and large that immediate family would be women. What's interesting is that the First World War was the conflict which saw more mutilations, disfigurements than any other conflict previously. By 1939, you've still got, as I said, about 500,000 people drawing war pensions because of their disability. So what you have is the traditional roles of women within family life, taking care of those who would, in today's society, may have be given more care from the state. So yes, very accurate.
I can understand that in the family context, but what I actually, if I gathered this right, is that women who lost, I mean, there were very few men left, and so many had been killed, that the women were offering themselves to those that they weren't related to, that they weren't particularly their family, that they were offering themselves in a dutiful way to serve those that, you know, they weren't family.
No, absolutely. You do get communities of the bereaved, as it's sometimes referred to. You get people who create communities of connections, networks within the local area, perhaps, who are volunteering their time, their efforts, their services to help others. Now, these may be people who have lost someone during the conflict and they feel obliged to help others who may have come back from the conflict and maybe as I said, mutilated or disfigured. But you do get the creation of new communities, new networks of people because of the conflict. And as I said, by and large, that would be women seen as the primary caregivers within 1920s, 1930s Britain.
Thank you. Gentleman there, then a gentleman there. Thank you.
Just sticking with the role of women for a moment, you mentioned that women, after seeing an explosion of opportunities or potential opportunities in the war, were expected to fall back and defer to men after the war. And certainly you get that feeling in Maugham's play, and you get that frustration. Was he not able to play this up because he set it in a rural area, whereas in an urban area, that was where some of these new moves were taking place, where typists were employed, where there was employment, where there was employment. In fact, one of the younger characters in the play makes up for the town, the urban area. So that rather sort of he used that to help polarise those different positions in males and females after the war.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question about the difference of experience in a rural community, and of course this play is set in a home counties-y type environment, in a house, as opposed to the opportunities there might have been for women in the cities. Absolutely,
and of course with Sydney there as well, of course, that restricts the women enormously. But I think you're quite right to have it set. I think it set in sort of an idyllic Kent, but also quite. I think it's quite close to it. We get some reference to it being quite close to a market town. I think that's meant to be. I think meant to be Canterbury, but also there's this idea of escape to a much more cosmopolitan environment as well. For the opportunity is possibly there as well of escape to a much more cosmopolitan environment for Lois. So to sort of think about that question in a little bit more depth, I suppose. This idea of the positioning that Maugham gives the play, I think it is essential, because if it was in an urban setting, I think some of the difficulties that the sisters have in particular, but also perhaps Gwen as well, though Gwen isn't there actually living permanently in that area, the opportunities would be slightly wider. But even so, the men returning to an urban area would still take back up the jobs in the factories, and perhaps then the women would have to go back onto the land or back into the home. Again, this kind of quasi-feminine environment anyway. So to answer your question briefly, I suppose, yes, Maugham knows exactly what he's doing by setting it in the home counties, yeah.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
A comment really rather than a question. The scene I particularly remember from the play, and I think it's one of the best things I've seen here for many years, is where Sidney is here somewhere, and he has a very impassioned speech about how the war has impacted on him and how it's affected him physically and mentally, and how dreadful it was. And the farmer character, whose name I can't remember, appears at the back of the stage somewhere. And he says, no, for me, this was great. You know, this was the best time of my life. And he actually uses those words. And I thought that was very, very important because, you know, we have all gone along with this myth of the 1920s, that it was all dreadful. And it rolls right through to, oh, what a lovely war, and Blackadder, and all the rest of it. And it's only really as we're approaching the centenary of the First World War that we're beginning to get, in my view, a more rational understanding of what it was all about and what its impact was. And it wasn't unremitting grief. You know, there was a lot of positive things that people were experiencing, and that's now becoming a bit more apparent. And I think the balance is shifting in our national perception of the First World War. But what interests me is the fact that Maugham picks this up at this very, very early stage, far in advance of the majority of people. And that's why I think this play is very important.
No, I think it's absolutely right. I think what you have with this play is a glimpse into how our understanding of the conflict has been formed. That during the 1920s and 1930s, even though the actual fighting had finished, the meaning of the conflict is still a battlefield, because there is a variety of different opinions about how we should remember the war. From the grand memorial landscapes in France and Flanders that tell you it was for God, King and Country, or God, Empire and King and Country, or a variety of variations on that theme, to those novels and memoirs which talk about the disillusionment of the war. You have, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, these differing voices as to what the conflict means. And ultimately, it's that disillusioned perspective that becomes the dominant vision of the conflict, one which perhaps is not accurate of what really happened during 1914 to 1918. You're absolutely right. What's interesting about this play is you see that moment when we begin to get those differing opinions about the war. Maugham's play reflects the way in which these ideas about the conflicts are being created. So you do have that scene which you have two hugely divergent opinions about the war. One disillusionment, one celebration of an adventurous life. So that's why Maugham's play I find incredibly interesting, because you get that battle of the memory of the conflict being played out in front of you. You can see it happening. And what's interesting is that this is a play which is then forgotten, and you begin to get the greater focus upon narratives of loss, sorrow, and disillusionment that we're particularly familiar with.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. Gentleman there.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion. I was wondering, from 1918 to 2015, do you think the cultural narrative that we have of World War I has got stronger or weaker, and why that may be?
So the question was, quite a large period of time, whether the cultural narrative of the First World War has got stronger or weaker. Miles.
I think
Before Ross said it, I thought I might as well.
Okay. I think for I think it'd be easier, actually, for somebody who's slightly older than myself to answer that. I think the more you've lived in the 20th century, the more of a nuanced response somebody be able to give you to that. I think thinking about last year's Field of Poppies at the Tower of London, for example, I think that brought the First World War much more. Obviously, the centenary brings it much more into focus. Before then, I suppose it's the last week of October and the first couple of weeks of November, and the poppy sellers, and it's kind of in a sense in the national consciousness up until 2014. It was restricted to then, I think. And of course, the time at the Cenotaph, and then of course we're we're already into building up for Christmas, aren't we? So that's in a sense, the First World War is kind of restricted to those 2-3 weeks in the year. Whereas last year, I felt that actually it lasted for a good few months, or maybe 6, 7, 8 months, maybe. So perhaps there's been an ebb and a flow through the 20th. There's been a slight ebb towards the end of the 20th century, but certainly last year with that sort of explosion of probably the art exhibition, I think that certainly refocused national attention on it.
I would say similarly that what you have with the place of the First World War within British cultural life has come and gone throughout the decades, and it emerges, I think, at points when people want to remember it for particular reasons in the present. That I think one of the most interesting things is the way in which the First World War is conjured up during the 1960s to talk about class division and class warfare. And you can look at the ways in which the First World War is conjured up to talk about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You can look at newspaper reports which talk about all quiet on the Helmand front, or you look at newspaper reports which reference the sad shires of Owen's poems that really create that image of the First World War and use it to understand what we are encountering in the present. And it's that way in which the First World War operates as some sort of intangible heritage. You can't touch it, you can't feel it, but it's there. You use it, and you use it to say something about who you are in the present. So today, even though you can still talk about being in the trenches and not refer to the Western Front, how your boss has left you out in no man's land by asking you to do something, you can talk about having to go over the top. You can reference how a condition at work was like the Somme. These are illusions that you draw on to say something about your current situation. So the war comes and goes. But as I said earlier, you keep on returning to the trenches because within those trenches you find something that says something about your condition, who you are in the present.
And to finish, as a writer, I would just add to that, which I think is absolutely right, is that when you write about war, and I write about war and the consequences of war in most of my work, there is a sense that readers today want to engage with the complicated emotions that anybody of any race, of any country, of any background, of any ethnicity, of any country in the world, going right back to the beginning, the human heart doesn't change very much. We understand grief, and we understand loss, and we understand the idea of fighting for something that you believe in. And oddly, the further back those things go, the more universal they become. So we can work out current fears through looking at a conflict that gets further and further away. And as we sit here today, I'm on the board of the National Theatre. Today, we are opening Warhorse in Beijing. Now, is there a cultural reference for the First World War in Beijing? No. Can it now be used as a touch paper for all those other conflicts? Has it become that thing? Yes. And Warhorse has now been running for 7 or 8 years. So on that, I hope, rather uplifting note, the idea that sometimes art speaks when the politicians fail. What about that as the way to finish? I'm afraid I do have to draw it to an end, which is incredibly disappointing because you two are brilliant. So I think this has been an incredibly fantastic experiment with experts. I just want to remind everybody that there's just a couple of performances left of the Somerset Morn. There are maybe 1 or 2 tickets left if you haven't seen it, but those of you who are going in tonight, we really hope you enjoy it. I will be back on the 15th of September in here to interview Michael Attenborough, former director of the Almeida Theatre. Theatre, making his Chichester debut with Frank McGuinness's play, Someone Who'll Watch Over Me, which is inspired by the hostage crisis and hostage-taking. Again, a different way of thinking about the consequences of war and conflict. But for now, could you give an enormous round of applause, please, for Dr. Miles Leeson and for Dr. Ross Wilson?